Welcome back to the Moonlit Nook. Today we continue our journey with Chapter 3 of The King of Elfland's Daughter. Alveric has crossed the border of twilight into the heart of Elfland itself, a place untouched by time, where magic flows like mist and the very air shimmers with enchantment. Chapter 3. The magical sword meets some of the swords of Elfland. When Alveric came to the enchanted wood, the light in which Elfland glowed had neither grown nor dwindled, and he saw that it came from no radiance that shines on the fields we know, unless the wandering lights of wonderful moments that sometimes astonish our fields and are gone the instant they come are strayed over the border of Elfland by some momentary disorder of magic. Neither sun nor moon made the light of that enchanted day. A line of pine trees, up which ivy climbed as high as their lowering black foliage, stood like sentinels at the edge of the wood. The silver spires were shining as though it were they that made all this azure glow in which Elfland swam. And Alveric, having by now come far into Elfland, and being now before its capital palace, and knowing that Elfland guarded its mysteries well, drew his father's sword before he entered the wood. The other still hung on his back, slung in its new scabbard over his left shoulder. And the moment he passed by one of those guardian pine trees, the ivy that lived on it unfastened its tendrils, and rapidly letting itself down, came straight for Alveric and clutched at his throat. The long thin sword of his father was just in time. Had it not been drawn, he would have scarcely got it out, so swift was the rush of the ivy. He cut tendril after tendril that grasped his limbs as ivy grasped old towers, and still more tendrils came for him, until he severed its main stem between him and the tree. And as he was doing this, he heard a hissing rushing behind him, and another had come down from another tree, and was rushing at him with all its leaves spread out. The green thing looked wild and angry as it gripped his left shoulder, as though it would hold it forever. But Alveric severed those tendrils with a blow of his sword, and then fought with the rest, while the first one was still alive but now too short to reach him, and was lashing its branches angrily on the ground. And soon as the surprise of the attack was over, and he had freed himself from the tendrils that had grabbed him, Alveric stepped back till the ivy could not reach him, and he could still fight it with his long sword. The ivy crawled back then to lure Alveric on, and sprang at him when he followed it. But terrible though the grip of ivy is, that was a good sharp sword, and very soon Alveric, all bruised though he was, had so lopped his assailant that it fled back up its tree. Then he stepped back and looked at the wood in the light of his new experience, choosing a way through. He saw at once that in the barrier of the pine trees the two in front of him had their ivy so shortened in the fight that if he went midway between the two of the ivy, that neither of them would be able to reach him. He then stepped forward, but the moment he did so, he noticed one of the pine trees move closer to the other. He knew then that the time had come to draw his magical sword. So he returned his father's sword to the scabbard by his side, and drew out the other over his shoulder, and going straight up to the tree that had moved, swept at the ivy as it sprang at him, and the ivy fell at once to the ground, not lifeless, but a heap of common ivy. And then he gave one blow to the trunk of the tree, and a chip flew out, not larger than a common sword could make, but the whole tree shuddered, and with that shudder disappeared at once a certain ominous look that the pine had had, and it stood there an ordinary, unenchanted tree. Then he stepped on through the wood with his sword drawn. He had not gone many paces when he heard behind him a sound that sounded like a faint breeze in the tree-tops, yet no wind was blowing in that wood at all. He looked around, therefore, and saw that the pine trees were following him. They were coming slowly after him, keeping well out of the way of his sword, but to the left and right they were gaining on him, and so that he saw he had been gradually shut in by a crescent that grew thicker and thicker as it crowded amongst the trees that it met on the way, and would soon crush him to death. Alveric saw at once that to turn back would be fatal, and decided to push right on, relying chiefly on speed, for his quick perception had already noticed something slow was about that magic that swayed in the wood, as though whoever controlled it were old or weary of magic or interrupted by other things. So he went straight ahead, hitting every tree in his way, whether enchanted or not. A blow with his magical sword, and the ruins that ran in that meadow from the other side of the sun were stronger than any spells that there were in the woods. Great oak trees with sinister boles drooped and lost all their enchantment as Alveric flashed past them with a flick of that magical sword. He was marching faster than the clumsy pines, and soon he left in that weird and eerie wood a wake of trees that were wholly unenchanted, that stood there now without hint of romance or mystery even. And all of a sudden he came from the gloom of the wood to the emerald glory of the Elf King's lawns. Again we have hints of such things here. Imagine lawns of our own, just emerging from the night, flashing early lights from their dewdrops when all the stars have gone, bordered with flowers that just begin to appear, their gentle colors all coming back after night, untrodden by any feet except the tiniest and wildest, shut off from the wind and the world by trees in whose fronds is still darkness. Picture these, waiting for the birds to sing. There's almost a hint there sometimes of the glow of the lawns of Elfland, but then it passes so quickly that we can never be sure. More beautiful than aught our wonders guesses, more than our hearts have hoped, were the dewdrops, lights, and twilights in which these lawns glowed and shone, And we have another thing by which to hint of them. Those seaweeds or sea mosses that drape Mediterranean rocks and shine out of the blue-green water for gazers from dizzy cliffs. More like sea floors were these lawns than like any of ours, and for the air of Elfland is thus deep and blue. The beauty of these lawns, Alveric stood gazing as they shone through twilight and dew, surrounded by the mauve and ruddy glory of the massed flowers of Elfland, beside which our sunsets pale and our orchids droop. And beyond them lay like night the magical wood, and jutting from that wood with glittering portals all open wide to the lawns, with windows more blue than our skies on summer nights, as though built of starlight, shone a palace that may only be told of in song. As Alveric stood there with his sword in his hand at the wood's edge, scarcely breathing, with his eyes looking over the lawns of the chiefest glory of Elfland, through one of the portals alone came to the King of Elfland's daughter. She walked dazzling to the lawns without seeing Alveric. Her feet brushed through the dew in the heavy air and gently pressed for an instant the emerald grass which bent and rose as our harebells do when blue butterflies light and leave them, roaming carefree along the hills of chalk. And as she passed he neither breathed nor moved, nor could have moved if those pines had still pursued him, but they stayed in the forest, not daring to touch those lawns. She wore a crown that seemed to be carved of great pale sapphires. She shone on those lawns and gardens like a dawn coming unaware out of long night, on some planet nearer than us to the sun, and as she passed Alveric, she suddenly turned her head and her eyes opened in a little wonder. She had never before seen a man from the fields that we know. And Alveric gazed in her eyes, all speechless and powerless still. It was indeed the Princess Lyrazel in her beauty, and then he saw that her crown was not of sapphires, but it was of ice. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice had the music that of earthly things, was most like ice in thousands of broken pieces rocked by a wind of spring upon lakes in some northern country. And he said, "I come from the fields that are mapped and known." And then she sighed for a moment for those fields, for she had heard how life beautifully passes there, and how there are always in those fields young generations, and she thought of the changing seasons and children and age of which elfin minstrels had sung when they told of earth. And when he saw her sigh for the fields we know, he told her somewhat of that land whence he had come. And she questioned him further, and soon he was telling her tales of his home and the Vale of Earl, and she wondered to hear of it, and asked him many questions more, and then he told her all that he knew of Earth, not presuming to tell Earth's story from that which his own eyes had seen in his bare scores of years, but telling those tales and fables of the ways of beasts and men that the folk of Earl had drawn out of the ages, in which their elders told by the fire at evenings, when children asked of what happened long ago. Thus on the edge of those lawns, whose miraculous glory was framed by flowers that we have never known, with the magical wood behind them and that palace shining near which may only be told of in song, they spoke of the simple wisdom of old men and old women, telling of harvest and the blossoming of roses in May, and when to plant in gardens, and what wild animals knew, and how to heal, and how to sow, and how to thatch, and of which of the winds and what seasons blow over the fields we know. And then there appeared to be those knights who guard that palace, lest any should come through the enchanted wood. 4 of them, they came shining over the lawns in armor, their faces not to be seen. In all the enchanted centuries of their lives they had not dared to dream of the princess. They had never even bared their faces when they knelt armed before her, yet they had sworn an oath of dreadful words that no man else should ever speak with her. If one should come through the enchanted wood with his oath now on their lips, they marched toward Alveric. Lyrazel looked at them sorrowfully, yet she could not halt them, for they came by command of her father, which she could not avert, and while she knew that her father might not recall his command, for he had uttered it ages ago at the bidding of fate, Alveric looked at their armor, which seemed to be brighter than any metal of ours, as though it came from one of those buttresses near, which are only told of in song, and then he went toward them, drawing his father's sword, for he thought to drive its slender point through some joints of the armor. The other he put in his left hand. As the first knight struck, Alveric parried and stopped the blow, but there came a shock like lightning onto his arm, and the sword flew from his hand, and he knew that no earthly sword could meet the weapons of Elfland, and he took the magical sword in his right hand. With this he parried the strokes of the Princess Lyrazel's guard, for such these 4 knights were, having waited for this occasion through all ages of Elfland, and no more shock came to him from any of those swords, but only a vibration in his own sword's metal that passed through it like a song, and a kind of glow that arose in it, reaching to Alveric's heart and cheering it. But as Alveric continued to parry the swift blows of the guard, that sword that was kin to lightning grew weary of these defenses, for it had in its own essence speed and desperate journeys, and lifting Alveric's hand along with it, it swept blows at the elvish knights, and the armor of Elfland could not hold it out. Thick and curious blood began to pour through rifts in the armor, and as soon as that glittering company two were fallen, and Alveric, encouraged by the zeal of his sword, fought cheerily, and soon overthrew another, and that only he and one guard remained, who seemed to have some stronger magic about him that had been given to his fellow comrades. And so it was, for when the Elf King had first enchanted the guard, he had charmed this elvish soldier first of all, while all the wonder of his runes were new, and the soldier and his armor and his sword had something still of this early magic about them, more potent than any inspirations of wizardry that had come later from his master's mind. Yet this night, as Alveric soon was able to feel along his arm and his sword, had none of those three master runes of which the old witch had spoken when she made the sword on her hill, for these were preserved unmuttered by the King of Elfland himself, with which to hedge his own presence. To have known of their existence, she must have flown by broom to Elfland and spoken secretly alone with the king. And the sword that had visited earth from so far away smote like the falling of thunderbolts, and green sparks rose from the armor, and crimson as sword met sword, and thick elvish blood moved slowly from wide slits down the cuirass, and Lyrizel gazed in awe and wonder and love, and the combatants edged away, fighting into the forest, and branches fell on them hacked off by their fight. In the ruins and Alveric's far-traveled sword exulted and roared at the elf knight, until in the dark of the wood, amongst branches severed from disenchanted trees, with a blow like that of thunderbolt riving an oak tree, Alveric slew him. At that crash and at that silence, Lyrizel ran to his side. "Quick," she said, "for my father has 3 runes." She durst not speak of them. "Whither?" said Alveric, and then she said, "To the fields you know." And that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. Alveric has taken his first steps into the wonder and danger of Elfland with the Princess Lyrizel by his side. The path before them's uncertain, and the magic deeper than he ever dreamed. Thank you for wandering into the mist and moonlight with me here at the Moonlit Nook. If you enjoyed this reading, I'd love for you to join me for the next chapter, where the journey grows even more enchanted and the mysteries of Elfland unfold a little further. I'll see you next time.